afternoon. I'm told trying to tell my life story in 25 minutes is kind of like speed dating. So this is non-dual speed dating we're doing here. I like the introduction because what I'm doing I think of as applied non-duality. A long time ago when I was teaching, I felt like I was always preaching to the choir. And I always wondered, how do we take this into mainstream marketplace? How do we work with populations we otherwise might not reach? In 2004, I got a call from Walter Reed Army Medical Center that one of my teachers had just delivered one of my practices at Walter Reed during a class that she had been invited to. And they were interested in seeing, would there be any effect of it with soldiers, wounded warriors coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq who had clinically diagnosed of PTSD? Might my protocol be effective? So I entered into a 3-year study with them, and at the end it was so effective they hired my teacher right on the spot. And so any wounded warrior coming through Walter Reed for the next 4 years had the ability to engage this form of meditation, which comes out of the nondual Kashmir tradition. Some of you know my spiritual mentor was Jean Klein, who I had the grace to be with from 1983 until 1998 when he passed. But I've also had some extraordinary gifted mentors over the years, both in the United States, Europe, and India, out of which I began to grow this protocol. It's based on a very ancient map of meditation that we find in the Shiva Sutras. But I wanted to see how could we deliver this in a way that I always thought, if I'm at the door after a class that I've given, after a meditation, as people are filing out, and in my course there was a Jew, a Catholic, a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, a Rosicrucian, a Sufi, one of everything. I thought the nicest thing would be as they were walking out, they each whispered in my ear, thank you for making the practice just for me today. How do we deliver these teachings, removing the word, we might say, spiritual, religious, philosophy, so we're not imposing. So I began to experiment with my students, and it really became a deep form of inquiry based on this timeless map, a 38-step map. And while my talk today is talking about when self falls away, I'm just going to touch a little bit on it because, you know, a soldier doesn't come to me with the desire to lose their sense of self. We're coming into homeless shelters. They don't come to me, they've already lost their home, they don't want to lose their self as well. We're coming now into Nepal. I just got a beautiful picture 3 days ago while I was here from my teacher, Petra Huber, who's in Nepal right now in Kathmandu. She had just taught an iRest in this little hut where they dry corn to a group of women who've been rescued from human trafficking. So we've translated the protocol now into Nepali, into Hindi. We're translating it into Bengali, working with women who are coming out of the brothels and women and men who've been rescued from human trafficking. We've been working in hospice, the homeless, mentally ill. We've got a program for preschool children, all the way through a 4-year study we've been doing at the University of Missouri at Columbia. So a really broad spectrum of people, we might say, who are the non-choir. What I've seen as we do this protocol, I've come to believe that there's a certain piece that if I don't deliver it right away, I feel like I'm doing malpractice. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I've spent many years, I might say, in the trench with people. I've worked in a mental hospital for a couple of years, a number of years ago. So I'd like to start off my talk today by giving you like a little 7-minute meditation. It's 5 questions that I'd like you to answer from your own first-hand experience. So I'd like you to put your books away, your teachers away, everything you've ever heard, everything you've ever read, and it is the immediacy of your first-hand experience in this moment that I'd like you to contemplate these inquiries, which I'm sure you've heard now over and over during this conference. Normally, this would be about a 20-25-minute meditation that I would do with you, but I'm going to cut it very short and ask you the questions, give a moment to contemplate, and then I'll kind of give you some answers that I have gotten from people in the homeless shelters, in the VA settings where I come into. And literally, this is the first thing I like to do. So I'm going to give it, and then I'm going to tell you why. So feel free to keep your eyes open or closed, but take a moment. You've finished lunch. You're not yet ready to go on to the next thing of doing, and you're just sitting here in a delightful sense of being. So just take a moment, open to this felt sense of being. For some of us, that even may be the felt sense of being awareness. And as you're moving into being, can you make the shift from being in being to being as being? And as being, I'd like to ask you 5 questions. Answer it from being. So as being, how would you describe your location? Your outermost border or boundary, your innermost center. Just feel into that for a few moments. How would I describe myself as being? One woman in a homeless shelter with no meditation experience, she said, I feel like I'm everywhere and nowhere specific, yet I feel myself as an undeniable presence. I feel myself as an undeniable presence that's everywhere and nowhere specific. Just see if that resonates with your own for a moment. And the second inquiry, as being, when you're just being, what's happening to thinking? When you're just feeling, being. And so we might ask, when you're just being, what time is it? What's your relationship to time? Another man in that same homeless shelter looked up to me and he said, who cares? So come back to being and ask yourself, as being, do I need anything that by acquiring it would make me as being any better than I already am? Do I as being lack or want for anything? The fourth inquiry, As being, are you unfamiliar, or is this something that you've known all your life? You may not spend much time every day nourishing it, but how familiar does it feel? And the fifth inquiry, as being, is there anything special I need to do to be? I'm cutting this very short because I don't have much time. Speed dating, you have to really press on the button. So look at what I just introduced us to. Something that is undeniably present as a presence, yet everywhere and nowhere specific. So I'm in my open spaciousness. I've stepped out of thought and time. I'm in the timeless. I'm somewhere in myself that's very familiar, that is beyond lack, wanting, or need. So I've stepped out of need. And there's nothing special I need to do about it. So a couple of months ago, I was at the Martinez VA, my first time there, with a group of inpatients with traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, depression, insomnia, and anxiety disorders. And I gave this over a 20-minute period, and then I asked for reflections. And there was a fellow over on my right who raised his hand and spoke up, and he said, I feel like I just came home. And the hair on the back of my neck and my arms just stood up. And it's something I've heard repeatedly. When we introduce someone to being, and these special audiences, say with trauma, are especially true, they have a feeling of homecoming. When I did this in that first homeless shelter in Petaluma, where I was doing an actual research with the noetic sciences on the impact of this with the homeless, there was a homeless woman in that first class when I did this. She said, I feel like I just came back to my true home. Now that I know this, I think I can deal with my homelessness. And a vet in one of our studies, I think it was out of Miami or Walter Reed, when we introduced to them, he said, every other protocol that I've been given up until this moment has been trying to show me what's wrong with me, how to fix this that I feel is broken and irreparable. He said, you've just shown me what's not broken, what's never been traumatized, hurt, and that doesn't need healing. He said, now that I feel this, I feel like I'm ready to work with what does feel broken and what does feel healing. And this is why I say it feels to me like malpractice if I don't introduce this to a person right away. Whether they're coming to a meditation class, whether they're coming to a retreat, or whether I find them in a homeless shelter, or at hospice where we're also doing work, no matter the person, because I want them to really feel deeply, what is it that's innate and inherent in us that can never be broken, doesn't need healing, never gets traumatized, and with this as our ground, now we can begin to look at what may need healing, the emotions that are present, the thoughts, and all of that. I've come to do some interesting neuroscience, and if I could get my PowerPoint turned on, this is a quick one that I always love, a little humor. So, Mr. Smithers, when did you first discover your sense of self was just an illusion? But if we look at the neuroscience, we see that there are these four networks, and Gary Weber just gave a delightful talk on one of them, the default network. When we meditate, when we go into the sense of being, which we just did, what we see in an MRI is our default network begins to just calm down. This is where we create a sense of past into the future, autobiographical, self-referencing sense of self. And people who are in trauma, this is turned on. They can't step out of it along with their limbic system. Their amygdala is turned on. Their hippocampus has basically been blown out, which gives them a sense of context and responsibility for their actions. So their limbic system is turned on, their ability to have context is turned off, and the default set network is going crazy. They're caught in these recursive loops. But when we do that simple exercise of being, and I have a series of exercises that I take people through, it turns off the recursive thinking. They step out of what we know as the negativity bias. This is the survival mechanism where we mistake sticks for snakes. And they're able to see things more directly. Also, their attention network turns on. This is where they're able to focus. And a lot of times when we're in trauma, we're blown out of our ability to attend. And the control network, which is a higher executive functioning, which mediates between the default and the dorsal and other networks, also comes online. And we actually see in trauma how the cortex thins out, the hippocampus shrinks, the amygdala gets larger, and there's a tendency for these executive functionings to get blown out. So when we look at this, these are these three networks, and we can see how they're all joined together and they each have their own separate network, but it's so interlinked. But when we do a simple thing as being, this default network turns off and the present-centered network turns on. What's the present-centered network? It's up here in the upper right-hand quadrant of the front brain with links into other parts of the brain. You have a reduced sense of beta, meaning you get more relaxed, and you get an increase of gamma. So why is that important? Because it's been shown in an MRI that the moment that precedes a moment of insight that isn't based on past thinking, it's a moment of true insight, you get a high burst of gamma in this region of the brain. And what we see is a person enters into a moment of not self. I have a talk I give, which I gave the other day, and if you're interested, we'll be doing an online course that we're coming out in November. You can go to my website, iRest.us, and you'll see the link that's coming up to this 3-hour workshop on the experience when self falls away. But today I'm just trying to touch on this. Why is that important? Again, when we take someone in trauma who's so caught in their recursive loopings, and we help them have this first kind of experience of not self, their autobiographical self begins to drop away, and they begin to have insight into what's going on with them, healing. And they land into what I think, as Dan Siegel said, the world of infinite possibilities, where trauma tends to keep us in a world where we lose connection to self and world around us. And in this moment of this first aspect of not self, there's a reconnection to self and a reconnection to the world. So we begin the process of healing. So we might say it switches off the default, switches on the present-centered network, and we have these sense where the default gets deactivated and the present-centered network gets activated. For me, that's the first step in working with a person, whether they have trauma or not, where we're working with different levels of self. I'll just briefly talk about these other aspects. And again, people who are coming from trauma, I don't necessarily take them into these next aspects, but they come automatically when we really work in deep work with a person in healing. And if we know them and we can recognize them, we can help people not get entrapped by them. As the autobiographical sense of self falls away, and think about it for your own experience, there's a sense of the witness deconstructing, and we more fall into this felt sense of being. Just a delightful sense of being, spacious, outside of time, outside of autobiographical self, familiar, thinking slows down, and we realize it's always here. So this is very important. I want people who I work with, again, whether they're a regular student or a person in trauma, to recognize that being is always here, and by recognizing it, we can begin to nourish it and feel it all day long. So one of the things I do is whatever emotion is arising, whatever thought, memory, I have them weave in this sense of being, which gives them a sense of ground when they're feeling groundless. I had a woman come in a couple of years ago with severe chronic depression. She'd been through many psychiatrists, all sorts of medications. And of course, we're the last one they're going to see. So she's in my office, and I said, would you be willing to make an experiment? She said, okay. So I took her through what I just took you through, but I took a long time really nourishing it over about a half an hour. And she was able to reconnect to this deep core sense of well-being that comes from being. Then we started to examine what was going on with her thought processes and her depression. What was interesting to me is she came back a week later and she said, you know, after I left your office, that experience of being slowly faded, but what it did for me is it gave me a sense of hope. For the first time in 4 years, I felt maybe there's a way through this. And so every time she visited me in my office, we would just start with being and really get it established, we might say, in the office. And then very slowly she was able to carry that more and more into her daily life, which gave her ground then and that sense of hope and faith that there was a way through her depression, which actually then we were able to address what does need fixing from a place that doesn't need healing, doesn't need fixing. And I'm happy to say I know her. She's all through the depression. That's a long time gone now. You know, some of the ways we can foster this sense of not self is through opposites. If you feel your left hand and you feel your right hand and you sense them both simultaneously, you just stepped out of your autobiographical self. You just turned on a little bit of gamma in your brain and you set yourself up for insight. I'm going to just nail these a few. The other way is let your attention feel itself everywhere, equally in front, behind, left and right, below and above. When you let attention unlocalize, you drop out of this default network and you start to turn on this present-centered network. Rupert was doing this in some of the meditations that he was giving. We can also move from being a witness to being witnessing. But what's interesting here, as you step into being, and just see if this is your own firsthand experience, as we're being, and you might try it out as we're here, feel how thinking slows down. Step out of autobiography. But there's still a kind of a subtle sense of I'm being. So there's another level of selfing here. And because my time is short, and I can talk a little bit more of this when we get into the panel if it's interesting. But as we step into being awareness, and awareness is folding on itself and is self-aware, there's another subtle level of selfing that's going on here. That if we don't recognize it, we can get caught in a subtle duality and a subtle way that we keep separation in place. Why might this be important for trauma? Because trauma disconnects us from self. The slightest separation that's maintained, in a way, maintains a sense, we might say, of trauma in us. Even if we've never really been through trauma, there's still a quality of separation there. So I'm trying to meet a person at different levels of self, autobiographical, witness, there's one below the witness, and this very subtle sense of self-awareness. Because there's a moment in meditation, in inquiry, where we're sitting in deep meditation, autobiographical has fallen away, the world has fallen away. We're sitting there in a deep quality of open, spacious awareness. And there's this subtle sense of commentator. I'm self-aware of this. And yet there's something else here that's calling us. there's a moment when that sense of self drops, and we go somewhere where there's no I saying, I'm here. It is only in coming back, when we come back with a little bit of the perfume of where I just was, where I am not. As we come back with that, all sense of fear, separation, all sense of anxiety begins to break up. So I'll end with that for the moment as a possibility in your own meditation practice. When you're sitting there with that subtle sense of self-awareness, there's one more step here. It's like falling asleep at night where you've done your work as an I for the day or for the lifetime or in meditation, and then you just sit there and you say, I'm ready, take me. And you'll never experience that moment of being taken. Why? Because the I completely goes away. It is only in the next moment when the I begins to reassemble where you really feel the perfume. But examine this, in my final thought, when you come back, watch the tendency, the conditioned tendency to say, I was unconscious. Oh, I went to sleep for a moment. Is it true? Did you just go to sleep unconscious? Or were you just taken? And now you're coming back in a very different state. Because if you had gone under anesthesia, you would come back as stupid as you were when you left. But when you be taken, you come back in a very different manner. And if we can understand that, we can ultimately heal the ultimate trauma of separation. So thank you, and I look forward to our panel.